I'm going to end up starting a lot of videos this way, aren't I? Hello, everybody. Leah Harlann here. Welcome back to my channel. Today, I'm going to talk about the upcoming YA fantasy debut, To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods by Molly X. Chang. I want to start by saying that I don't plan to do a deep dive into recent events surrounding Chang, mostly because I'm sure other booktubers will do a better job, but I will go ahead and briefly sum up in case you are completely out of the loop. Molly X. Chang was one of the authors that was targeted by Kate Corain in the fake Goodreads review mess that broke last December. And she was a notable victim because she was originally a co debut author under the same publisher alongside Corain and received rather specific hate comments from Kate's fake accounts. There was also some controversy or scandal earlier this month claiming that Chang was doxing or harassing people who left negative reviews of her book, but she has claimed that this was a misunderstanding stemming from personal social circle drama that bled out into online spaces. I'm not sure what the true story is, and I'm not very interested. I'm here mostly to talk about the book today. All right, so moving into the book itself, to give you an idea of what it's about, To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods, which is set to release April 16th, is the story of 19-year-old Yang Ruying, a girl who wields death magic, but tries to live as far under the radar as possible while taking care of her grandmother and twin sister. Ruying's world, Pengu, is a fictionalized China. The empire she lives in, Erlang, was conquered about 20 years ago by Rome. Yes, that Rome, but not the exact same Rome, I think, because this one has modern technology like machine guns and airplanes, but is still an empire. Oh, and they came through a magic portal in the sky.
What the fuck?
So it's like almost an alternate universe Rome, and I think the world Rome comes from is basically our world, but as if the Roman Empire was still existing. That's not very clear. Ruying has been barely scraping by until one day she revealed her death magic in front of a Roman who is later revealed to be Antony Augustus, the second prince of Rome. Antony basically forces Ruying to work for him as his personal assassin, promising to bring peace to both of their nations if she helps him. But the more she kills her fellow pangolins, and the closer the two of them become, the more she questions if this is really for the greater good. I read this book back in December, thanks to NetGalley for giving me a digital ARC copy. So I read it while I was visiting family for the holidays, so please bear with me if my memory is a bit fuzzy in places. Ultimately, this book was just not what I was hoping for or expecting, but maybe you will feel differently, and that's okay. I'll go over what I liked and didn't like in a spoiler-free section first, and then I'll dive a little bit deeper and talk about some spoilers later on in the video. So first, to talk about what I liked, there were some specific lines that I thought were very well written, and I think Chang wrote a strong depiction of what colonization looks like in more of an everyday framing for some of the people being oppressed. Since Chang says in the beginning of the book that she was heavily inspired by her grandfather's stories of Manchuria when it was occupied by the Russians and Japanese during World War II, it makes sense to me that this element of the story was handled with a lot of her personal feelings and motivations, and in my opinion, a decent amount of thought and care. I also really like the way that Chang describes the magic that Ruying wields. I think her prose comes across really well in these specific instances of Ruying wielding her death magic. The way she describes like how it works paints a very vivid image in my head. I really do like the way the prose in the specific instances of Chang describing Ruying using her magic and sort of the way it's visualized for her. I thought that was very creative and original. because even though I've seen like imagery with strings when tied to souls and life, I don't think I've ever seen it executed quite this way. I also really liked the character of Baihu, even though we don't see very much of him, for reasons that I'll go into a little bit more, but a lot of those thoughts will be in the spoiler section of the video. And that's the end of what I liked, I'm sorry to say. So now to get into everything I did not like. This story, in my opinion, needed another round or two of edits to remove some of the bloat and add in more plot and character development. I also question the target age demographic of this book. It's categorized as YA, and it does read fairly YA, not in a demeaning or condescending way. It's just certain writing styles lend themselves more to YA than adult. But the ages of most of our main characters are 19 to like early 20s, which is outside of the YA age demographic, which is usually 12 or 13 to 18. Del Rey, who is the US publisher, is also an adult imprint usually, so this also lends itself to some of the confusion. Hi everyone, Editor Leah here, just chiming in because I did do some digging and I found evidence on Molly's Instagram that she does classify To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods as an adult novel. So, if anything, that would be considered concrete confirmation. However, contrary or contradicting this, Amazon and Goodreads both classify this book as young adult, so it's very easy to see where the confusion comes from. Speaking as a librarian, I would not personally recommend this book to the younger end of the YA demographic due to certain events in the book, the character ages, and the depiction of the main romance. For some specific elements that I have issue with, or that just didn't really vibe with me, first is the pacing. The pacing in Wicked Gods is very inconsistent. The first 20% had almost nothing happening, because every chapter was buried under exposition dumping via inner monologue, because this book takes place primarily through Ru Ying's perspective, and also conversations between characters that were very clunky. And then by the 40% mark, Ru Ying still had not begun this part of the plot of being an assassin under this enemy prince, which is, in the main synopsis and summary of the book that is used everywhere. So the fact that that hasn't even started by the 40% mark was bothersome. It was bothering me. The plot just took a very long time to get going. And then once it did, it would have these very short sections of light speed plot developments and action interspersed between these very long, drawn-out sequences of Ru Ying and the enemy prince's relationship dynamic. And then, in the very last 30 pages, everything that sets up the next book happens all at once. It was readable, at least. I don't think I had trouble making good progress whenever I sat down to read it. But I feel like at least part of that was because I was constantly waiting for it to get good. I was giving it the benefit of the doubt all the way up until I hit the last page and was just flabbergasted that that was the end, that was where we were leaving off until the next book. The next problem I had was the writing style, and this is very evident from the first page. Chang had a lot of what I would call purple prose. A ton of metaphors and similes, some that were good and some that just left me very confused. Very descriptive writing of expressions, actions, emotions, but so much of it felt redundant and repetitive. Either she lingered too long on describing something, or she would follow it up with just telling us the exact same things, making all those paragraphs of subtext into text. It often felt like the author didn't trust us as readers to understand what she was getting at with the metaphors. And so she would just make explicit statements of what the characters were feeling or talking about. And those would just be tacked on at the end after like 2 or 3 paragraphs of, very flowery descriptions and metaphorical talking about things. It was also a lot of telling and not showing, because very little of the text was used on characters doing anything. And a lot of the internal introspection that Ru Ying has doesn't feel like it's part of a real developmental arc of hers. And that really leads me to the last point, which is I just really did not like Ru Ying. And not even just in like the kind of like, oh, she starts off as like a bad or flawed character, so I don't like her. I do not like being in her head. It was very boring or annoying, depending on what was happening on the page. Ru Ying would act so jaded and world-weary at one moment, and then say something or do something laughably naive in the very next paragraph. Her character felt very inconsistent, like there were two versions of Ru Ying that the author was writing, but they were not cohesive. They did not mesh together. I think Chang was trying to write her as a morally gray character, or at least one that was experiencing inner moral conflict. But it read more like Ru Ying was just wishy-washy and even hypocritical at times. I understood her surface level motivations because they were outright stated numerous times. She's doing bad things for the sake of her family. She's murdering people to keep her family safe. But I did not sympathize with this motivation, and I couldn't root for her because I was so often bothered by her behavior and her choices that sometimes seemed completely counterproductive to this motivation. And then by the time we get to the really abrupt ending, I wasn't left wanting more, but just instead with a general feeling of that's it, that's where we're ending. And it even tried to end with this sort of girl boss inner monologue, one of those one-page chapters, but it just fell completely flat for me. Ultimately, the action that happens in the last 100 pages, so the last third of the book, feels like the inciting incident for the entire overarching trilogy or series. I don't remember how many books this will be, but I just don't feel impatient for the next book, and it didn't leave me with a sense of anticipation for where it's going to go from here. So that's the end of my spoiler-free section. If you want to jump ahead to this timestamp, you can get to some later thoughts I have, some other recommended readings, and some opinions about some other parts of the book that are not spoilers. But now we'll dive into the spoiler section. And I think one of the best ways to illustrate just how little happens in this book is to give you a point-by-point summary of the entire plot, only containing what characters do during the course of this book. So the very first thing that we do that happens in this book is chapter 1 is Ru Ying walking down a street. Chapter 2 is I'm not kidding. The entire first chapter is just Ru Ying walking down a street and having a ton of internal monologue, exposition dumping on us, the reader, about Rome, about magic, her magic, about how much she hates the Romans and how much they've colonized everything. All she does in that time is walk down a street. And then in the next chapter, she goes to the Lotus Tower and meets her childhood friend Baihu and is buying opium from him, which opium is basically just opium. So if I slip up and call it opium, I'm sorry. But that really is, it's like an exact parallel to opium, even the way it's used in the story. To a certain degree. So she's going to buy opium from Baihu. Baihu tries to rope her into using her death magic for a good cause, and he promises to protect her family. She rejects his offer. So after she leaves the Lotus Tower, after she leaves the meeting with her friend, she sees a random Roman on her side of the city giving money to a beggar, and in a moment of vulnerability where he has left his money pouch unattended, she steals it, and despite knowing how risky this is, and then she is chased down by soldiers. She is forced to use her death magic, but she doesn't kill the soldier. She just leaves him on the verge of death. But the Roman that she stole from sees her using her magic and has this whoa, that's awesome. Whoa, that's really cool magic. But she escapes with the help of her other childhood friend, Taohua, and then she goes home. Then her grandmother leaves, and 3 days later, a raid happens where Roman soldiers invade her side of the city, her people's side of the city, and she kind of like stows her sister away in like a hidden cubbyhole in their house because her sister is too weak to run due to like opium withdrawals. And she tries to fight them off, but fails and is captured. Then Ru Ying spends a really, really long time in prison. And by long time, I mean a high page count. I think in terms of like time passing in the book, it was about a week. In that time, Taohua, her best friend, is also captured and taken somewhere else. Baihu comes to visit, promises to try to get both of them out, and says something along the lines of like Ru Ying wasn't supposed to be taken and that raid wasn't supposed to happen. And then she is paraded in front of the Roman princes, the older one, Valentin, and the younger one, Antony. And oh my gosh, lo and behold, that younger Prince Antony is the one that she stole from. So crazy. What are the odds? And she is told to like perform her magic for them. And she uses this opportunity to try and escape, but fails. And so after that, Antony comes to her cell where she's put again and makes a deal with her that in exchange for becoming his personal assassin and eliminating his political rivals, he will take care of her family. And also she asks for Taohua she demands that Taohua be released as well, her best friend. And he agrees. So she is let out, and then he puts her through a series of tests I'm not sure, like they've already technically made this deal, but he wants to do these tests to make sure that she will actually follow through when he gives her orders. So she fails the first one. She was supposed to just kill. He points out a window and tells her to kill a guy, and she refuses. And then after that, he takes her to her house, and while sitting outside her house in a car, threatens to harm her family unless she shoots him. And she does actually follow through with this one, but the gun was empty, of course. So, but he's like, I guess that counts as passing because she was willing to shoot him. And then the final test is locking her in a cage with another magic user, and then they have to fight to the death. And there's really no way she can get out of it this time because Antony explicitly says, only one of you will leave this cage. So that is the first time she kills. And then after that, 6 months pass.
What the fuck?
She killed a guy. They finally kind of come to a real agreement that she's gonna work for him. He promises that it's actually for the good of both their nations and peoples if she works for him, because all the people he wants her to kill are going to bring them to war, and he just wants peace. So she agrees, but she says she can't trust him. And then 6 months pass, and she's killed 48 people. Like, what? 48 people dead. None of that on page. And so now she's super good at using her gift, and she has to, and she's good at carrying out his orders, and she kind of has some conflicting feelings about having killed innocent people, or at least people that she's pretty sure are innocent. And then we just get back to more stuff, conversations, and there's really not that much happening other than conversations. And then we jump to the final third of the book, which is the prince, Antony, is going to go to a neighboring empire to sign some kind of treaty. And basically, as soon as the ink is dry on the treaty, he wants Ru Ying to assassinate the emperor of that empire. And they have an argument about this. And ultimately, she kind of decides that she's not going to do it. But then the emperor dies anyway because these rebels, who have been fighting in the shadows against Rome the entire time, choose that time to attack the treaty signing event in an attempt to kidnap Antony. And they fail, but the emperor dies in the crossfire. And so in that failed attempt, Ruying and Antony escape but are wounded. And then after a little bit of time, the rebels do track them down, and they both try to sacrifice themselves, like give themselves up to save the other. Antony gets Ruying to escape, but then he stabs himself, and so she runs back for him. And then very coincidentally and conveniently, the Roman soldiers, like his bodyguards, show up just in time to save them both and chase the rebels off. And so Antony is rushed back to the city to be healed. And in that time, her childhood friend Baihu reappears. He's been with the rebels this whole time, and he's been trying to convince Ruying that, you know, she's on the wrong side. And at this point, he shows her what Antony's been doing the whole time she's been working for him. He takes her to these secret labs and shows her that he's been experimenting on her people, their people, this whole time. And specifically in this instance, she sees her best friend being experimented on and killed in this scene, which it's been 6 months since Antony had promised that he would let her go, that he would let her best friend go. So he lied. Big shock. And then basically at that point, she goes and confronts Antony, pretends to forgive him. And then the book ends with her going to meet with Baihu and them deciding they need to make a plan to take down Antony. So I think she's kind of joining the rebels. It's not really clear if she's joining the rebels like as the organization or if she's just going to work with Baihu. That's the entire book. She starts off living her life, struggling to get by. She gets roped into being the personal assassin of the enemy prince. 6 months go by and she kills 48 people. She finally decides to not kill someone that he wants her to kill. And then she finds out that he's been lying to her, and she basically decides to turn against him. I'm really not exaggerating that is, in essence, everything that happens. Everything else is a lot of internal monologuing, a lot of conversations that go nowhere or don't tell us very much, and just it just feels like a lot of wasted pages when, at least for my digital copy, this was only a 300-page book. And yet so much of it felt wasted. There's just, to go into a little more detail, I guess, I won't give you a full play-by-play because, full disclosure, this is my second time recording this video. The first time I did try to go, give you a full play-by-play of my reactions to reading the book with the notes and annotations I had made while reading, but that ended up being 3.5 hours long in total. And I don't want to deal with editing all of that. So we're trying this again. And this is why I probably won't do reading vlogs anytime soon. But so getting back to just the general, like I said in the spoiler-free section, I have a major problem with the pacing in this story. The middle is such a massive slump in action. 48 kills happen off page. And in this portion, this middle 100 or so pages, all that happens are a few conversations that try to shake Ruying's faith in Antony, and then one more assassination. She does kill one more odd person that leads into a confrontation with her sister, where her sister tries to convince her that hey, the guy you're in love with, that Roman prince, is not good. He's evil. He's doing really evil things. Open your eyes. And Ruying is just full team Antony right now, so she doesn't listen to anybody. And so we're just, as readers, I feel or at least for me, I was so irritated with her because it was very obvious from the beginning that Antony was very manipulative, that he was he was trying to forge these connections between them that, like, you know, he understands her like nobody else can, and he's had some tragic stuff happen in his life too, and you know, the both of them are people that wield like really great power, so much that it could scare them, but they should use it, stuff like that. And it feels very manipulative, but then in that 6-month time skip, where we probably would have seen Ru Ying gradually falling under his control and gradually kind of like falling in love with him, we don't get to see any of that. So then we just jump ahead and suddenly she's got blind love and faith in Antony, and nothing anybody else can say, even her family, even her childhood friends, can change her mind. And it just feels very unearned. And then we do the last 100 pages, which is just full of light speed action and plot development. Like I said, the trip to Sihai, the neighboring empire, the death of the emperor, this cabin scene that is just chock full of romance tropes happening between Antony and Ru Ying, the like confrontation, sacrifice that leads to them going back to the city, and Antony being kind of out of commission for a few days, Baihu taking the opportunity to show Ru Ying the truth at the labs, and then these final conversations between Antony and then between her and Baihu. It's just so much. And I mean, I did read like that whole last 100 pages, I think, in almost one sitting. But it was just, you know, we had gone from all of these long like conversations and inner monologues and an inner conflict kind of that Ru Ying's having, to just like now all of this outward external stuff is happening. And in all of those things that are happening, Ru Ying has very little agency. In fact, for most of the book, Ru Ying has very little agency. Basically, from the point she is kidnapped, she has no control over what happens to her from then on. She seemingly is negotiating this deal with Antony, but in reality, like, she would have to do whatever he wants or he would kill her and her family. And she's having all this conflict about the people she's killing, but when she finally puts her foot down and doesn't want to kill the Sihai emperor, he dies anyway. And she gets swept along in all of this other action that's happening with no control over it. And even the ending is not her coming to these conclusions on her own that breaks her faith and perception of Antony. It's Baihu showing her and telling her, and then talking to Antony and Antony telling her and admitting to things. Like, she doesn't, and then she decides to pretend to forgive Antony, and then to finally show a bit of spine and go and see Baihu. And so it's just very, very frustrating. Especially those last 30 pages, basically from the time they go back to Jing City, the main city where most of the book is happening. The lab scene and then the conversation with Antony dump a ton of info on us that is pretty obviously relevant and setting up things for the next book, but it feels very weird in this book. There's like a character introduced that we had only mentioned maybe twice back in the beginning of this book, and she's been off page the entire time. And then suddenly we see her; she is like thrown right in front of us, and then we just move on. Nothing happens related to that character. We just get the book going. Here is this character. This is where she is, and then we move on. And then lots of random bits of lore being dumped on us that hasn't come up or been mentioned at all up to this point, but is very clearly going to be relevant from now on. And it's kind of clunky in like the conversations where it's introduced, and just a lot of this. And then the lab scene in particular is so bad. And that's really I felt like uncomfortable while reading it, not because of the fact that it's like, on screen, on page, human experimentation happening, but because like Ru Ying is just being dragged through this. And not only have numerous people been telling her numerous times throughout the story that Antony is a shady person, that he is doing horrible, horrible things, and she just hasn't seen it, and he's lying to her. And she never, ever, ever even had a hint of doubt for him. But I believe there were at least one or two other instances where the human experimentation was explicitly brought up to Ru Ying, and it doesn't register with her. She just doesn't even think about it. She just completely moves past it, doesn't even acknowledge it. But then now that she's seeing it, and now that it's her best friend that's being experimented on, now it's like, this is when it finally does something to her. This is when it finally affects her. And so it kind of makes me as the reader feel like, so you'll forgive human experimentation, but you draw the line at human experimentation on your best friend that your boyfriend lied about, like the lying and the fact that it was Taohua is what is the deal breaker for you?
I can excuse racism, but I draw the line at animal cruelty.
You can excuse racism.
And I don't know if Chang intended it to be that way, but that's how it reads, especially because these horrible things were hinted at or told to Ru Ying earlier in the book multiple times, and she either didn't care or just didn't think about it. She chose to ignore it basically. But now that she can't ignore it, and now that it's more directly related to her, this is what gets her to care. And that really bothers me as the reader. It's another part of why I don't like Ru Ying. And so it's just, the whole scene is very bad. And the fact that it's human experimentation, her friend is being, it's very we're watching Ru Ying have this sort of emotional breakdown, bemoaning the fact that Antony lied to her, while Taohua is literally dying in the background. She is actively being killed. Her body is being completely drained of blood, and she's screaming in pain in the background. But Ru Ying is he lied to me. And Baihu's yep, he lied to you. And that just did not sit well with me in so many ways. And then she goes and talks to Antony about it. And he's like, yeah, we were doing that, but in fairness, we were kind of already experimenting on her anyway by the time you asked for me to to let her go. So it was kind of too late, oops. As if that's supposed to make it okay. And then he talks about what they're doing with the experiments, something about her people's blood cells, because of the magic and stuff that has been in their bloodlines, their cells have ridiculous amounts of energy, the key energy in them. But apparently there's some idea that Antony has that the energy can power their cities. So, by the way, the main conflict for Rome, what Antony's, or at least what Rome's goal is by being in Pengu, is their world is dying because of climate change. That's Rome's big problem, climate change. And so the reason that they've been hanging around here in Pengu, in Erlang, which has been a mystery for most of the book, is because they've been doing these human experiments to try to figure out how to harness this energy that's in her people's blood to solve their energy crisis. It's just so ridiculous to me. I think people as human batteries is kind of an interesting concept that has been played with in other media and especially I think in sci-fi in some ways. But which, this is trying to be kind of a science fantasy book because Rome's got the science, but Pengu has the magic. But it just, it's so late in this story, and it's so muddied in the conversation that's more about Ru Ying's feelings that I feel like the impact was lost. The impact of the reveal of what the human experimentations were about was just buried under all of this other feelings and romantic mess that, anyway, it was just a very poorly played out scene and ending, in my opinion. And that's why, I mean, honestly, I think a lot of the problems with this plot could have been solved if, and I think a lot of what I think the kind of story Chang wanted to tell would have been much more effective if Ru Ying had just accepted Baihu's proposition at the beginning of the story. Because at the beginning, Baihu says, hey, if you use your death magic for our cause, which he doesn't tell her back in the beginning that he's with the rebels, but he basically says, like, I have the ability to protect you and your family too, or I have the ability to protect you and your family if you're willing to use your magic for me. And she like grossly misinterprets what he's getting at because she has a major distrust of Baihu at the beginning. She assumes he's like a traitor. He sold out to Rome. He is working for the first prince, Valentin. And so despite being childhood friends and despite Ru Ying having once had feelings for Baihu and him very obviously having feelings for her now, she doesn't even entertain the notion of working with him. And she's just there to get opium for her sister and detests every moment of having to interact with him. So she turns him down. But I think if she had taken him up on this offer, it would have made a much better story because she would have retained so much more of her agency. Baihu's proposition did not come with like holding her family hostage. He didn't threaten her or her family at any point. And in fact, like I said, was offering to protect them. Whereas Antony's proposition was like, sure, I'll protect your family. But he also was like willing to threaten them and hang them over her head anytime she showed even the slightest bit of resistance. So she really didn't have any agency in the setup with Antony. But I also think that working with Baihu would have better fit her motive of protecting her family while doing bad things, like being willing to do bad things and murder people for the sake of her family. Because not only does she have the agency to choose and to be making this decision herself instead of having that choice taken away from her, but if she's working with Baihu, who was her childhood friend, she also probably would have been doing more things that weren't like, yes, she probably would have been killing people, but it wouldn't have been so obviously in service to the colonizers. And it wouldn't, I mean, even if she thought that she was agreeing to work for him and thereby through proxy work for Valentin, like it's just, she would have at least had a lot more control over her situation, and she would have had a lot more time with Baihu, so we would have had a very interesting character arc of watching her initial trust and doubt in Baihu clear up and develop over time once it became clear that he was actually working against the Romans and that he was with the rebels. And so we would have seen that he was doing the right thing the whole time, and then we would have seen Ru Ying's conflict of this initial, like, I'm doing bad things for the sake of protecting my family, to then evolving into, like, I'm doing bad things for the sake of my family, but it's also helping my people. But we don't get any of that. And in reality, finding out Baihu works for the rebels is just like a conversation that they have in the second half of the book. And Ru Ying still hates him, but now she also, like, she's still very much Team Antony. She doesn't hate Baihu as much anymore, but it is very much like a scene that illustrates hypocrisy in Ru Ying. And I'll just use that. I'll keep that for this next bit, because I want to talk about Ru Ying's inconsistency in more detail. There's a lot of aspects of her character where I feel like Chang was trying to have it both ways. And that just didn't work well because it ended up feeling hypocritical or like very flip-floppy for Ru Ying. So firstly, her powers. I really liked the way Chang wrote how her magic works. I really liked the way she depicted the death magic. And I even kind of vibed with death being like this kind of personified character that spoke to Ru Ying and that had like feelings and stuff. There's an interlude chapter, like that's just one page where we get to read like Death watching over Ru Ying and kind of like observing that, you know, for a girl who with the powers of death, she's very afraid of death. And oh my gosh, actually, just quick side note, the phrase girl blessed by death is overused way too often in this book. It's not just her, she uses it for herself. And then so many other characters call her the girl blessed by death. And it just feels so trite. And I was cringing every time I read it after like the third instance of it coming up. So anyway, her powers. Ru Ying is like very much of two minds about her magic. On the one hand, she often feels this temptation to use her powers, and she knows that it's very like strong magic, you know, the ability to take life without even sometimes having to touch someone. And then therefore this holding back, this caution in using it. Mostly the caution coming from like for the sake of like safety, you know, not wanting to paint a target on her back, and the fact that magic users in Pengu use their own life force to power their magic. But it's a very imprecise way of knowing how much of your life force goes into using your magic. Everyone just knows that if you use it too much, you will die. You will exhaust yourself. And so there's this caution that comes from having this very strong magic, but not wanting to exhaust herself and wanting to, again, lay low, at least in the beginning of the book, lay low and keep her family safe by not drawing attention to themselves. But then the other side is this sort of disdain for her gift. She calls it a curse multiple times, usually when talking to her sister, because her sister urges her to use her gift for the greater good and to fight for their people. But Ru Ying very much gets defensive and says that it's very much a curse and that she's afraid of it because there was an incident in her childhood where she killed another young boy on accident, and that was the first time she had used her magic and therefore discovered what it was. And so she almost, there's this fear of her powers, and that lends itself to the caution that she has. But these two concepts, like being tempted to use her strength, but being afraid of it, but not wanting to draw attention to herself, but also hating it, like they don't all quite mesh together. You can definitely have sort of disdain and fear and hatred of your gift, and that would lend itself to not wanting to use it, especially when you know that there are material consequences, that of using your own life force to do it. And she often describes the temptation to use her power as death itself, like whispering to her, like hearing his voice trying to coerce her into using it, especially when her own life is at risk. But sometimes she and Antony talk about using her powers like it's a temptation just to be powerful. And I don't understand that. That is not a motivation that is properly seated within Ru Ying in any way, because I believe that we are supposed to see Ru Ying as a coward who wants to just, you know, eke a living out day by day and keep her family safe. That doesn't reconcile with being tempted to use a power you have just for the sake of like being powerful and wielding it over others. She very often comments that like if she wanted to, she could pluck people's lives out of the air because she visualizes their life as strings, and it would be so easy for her. Except also she's very untrained and unpracticed in using her power because she doesn't use it because it would cost her life force. And so it's just a lot of mental acrobatics that do not work for me. This like kind of split perception of her powers. And if it was like a back and forth conflict, I would understand it better. But that's not really what happens. It's just that like sometimes she thinks of her powers one way when talking to one character, and then sometimes she thinks of her powers another way when talking to another character. Another aspect is this aspect of us believing Ru Ying to be cowardly, but then her like pulling out these random girl boss moments out of nowhere. Like, so often we're told that she won't do anything, she won't step out of line, or she won't, help or take action because she believes it would put her family at risk. But then numerous times during her initial interactions with Antony, and even later on, like when she decides to question him, or when she like during the tests, when she tries to resist following along with him, these are all things that put her family at risk directly. And when she's like being very sassy and talking back to him, and talking back to like Valentin and other characters that have power over her, it's like, why are you being so outwardly like aggressive, or like talking back to these people who could kill your family with a wave of their hand? That doesn't reconcile with your supposed primary motive being to keep your family safe. And then just general hypocrisy throughout the book. Even when Baihu's not there, Ru Ying judges Baihu for working with Valentin and calls him a traitor, and says, like he's given up his dignity for Rome. And then she just, once she's roped into this agreement with Antony, she's constantly trying to justify her actions as being for the sake of her family. She's like, yes, I'm killing my fellow people. Yes, I'm working for Antony. But like, he says it's for the greater good. He says it's actually helping both of our people, even though Antony has not proven this or corroborated this claim in any way. And so she's like, I'm doing this for my family. I'm doing this for the sake of our people. But Baihu's still definitely a traitor, and she definitely still judges Baihu all the way up until she finds out that he's actually been a spy the whole time. And then he even calls her out on this. He even says something along the lines of like, for 3 years, you've been calling me a traitor, and you've been hurling like vitriolic judgment at me. So how can you stand there and justify killing for Antony's sake, for Rome's sake, like, and then having judged me all this time? And she basically just says, I don't care. She's like, I don't care. He's like, Antony is a horrible person. Antony has been doing horrible things. And he's claiming it's for the sake of the greater good, but you don't know that because he's actually just a horrible person. And she's like, I don't care. I don't care what he's doing, and I will side with him. And then Baihu says, like, you could join our side. Like, I'm a spy. Like, for the rebels, if you join the rebels, we can protect you the same way Antony's been protecting you and your family. Like, you don't have to side with him and do horrible things. Like, you can join us and fight for your people against the Romans. And then she basically says, okay, but the Phantom has done awful, horrible things, so I don't want to work for him. And it's like,
what the fuck?
You just said you don't care that the Colonizer prince does horrible things. You're going to side with him. And we know that that's kind of because she's in love with him too. But like, that just doesn't hold up. And for some reason, Baihu like lets this go and is still willing to give her another chance later in the book. Like, I don't know if I would have given this girl another chance if I was Baihu. But yeah, just that major hypocrisy. I don't really want to show you like explicit pages and quotes because I did have a digital arc, and considering that any or all of this could be different in the final product, I don't want to show very specific examples. But yeah, just that specific scene really, really bothered me and made me kind of like hate Ru Ying. I was already not liking her, and that just didn't help her case. And then finally, this sort of misplaced trust she has this trust is very inconsistent with Ru Ying. She, in the very beginning, is hyper suspicious of both Baihu and Taohua for some reason. Baihu, of course, she thinks he's a traitor because he's working for Baihu or for Valentin, even though he clearly wants to help her and her family. And they've known each other for years, but she thinks of him as a traitor. And then Taohua is in the Erlang military, like her people's military. And it's very clear that Taohua knows about some things that are happening, but she can't tell Ru Ying about them. And for some reason, Ru Ying, despite Taohua saying Taohua's her best friend and they've known each other since children, since they were children, Ruying seems to think that Taohua would turn her sister in, or like turn on them, if she ever knew that like Maya was addicted to opium or part of the rebels. Sorry, I think it's more the rebel thing. Her sister has joined the rebels, but doesn't seem to be taking part in certain activities. And Ruying judges her sister for this too, a lot, which is weird because reading it, you wouldn't think that they're twin sisters that are the same age, because Ruying talks about Maya like she's several years younger than her and that she has to look out for her. And I get the looking out for her from the perspective of her sister is addicted to opium, but she also doesn't respect her sister's agency and decision to join the rebels and to have taken opium because she was hoping to enhance her own gift, which has more of a supportive role. She can heal and she can amplify the gifts of other people. So she became addicted to opium because she was trying to enhance her gift to help the rebels. And we see in her the conflict that she has and her frustration with Ruying, who initially was refusing to use her powers, but now is willing to use them for this Roman prince. And she knows the arrangement. Like, she knows that Ruying is being threatened too, but she is just really upset with her. And I get that. I sympathize with Maya. And so, yeah, Ruying doesn't trust any of those people. She's not willing to respect any of their decisions, but she flips for Antony so fast. It's like 2 conversations where he is very obviously manipulating her into feeling like they have some kind of common ground and common interest. And she's initially like, she's just like, well, okay, maybe I can give him a chance. Like, he says he'd be, a good ruler if I help him end up being like, getting the throne after his grandfather dies instead of like his brothers. He promises to do good stuff for my people that he's colonizing. So sure, let's give him a shot. And it's like, really? You spent so much of the first third of the book talking about how much you hate Romans and all the horrible things they've done to your people, but you're willing to give him a shot just because of like a couple conversations where he gives you like a bit of a tragic backstory? That's just so messed up. And I have to say, like, Antony as a character is just very inconsistent in his own ways. In the beginning, he very much seems like a cold-hearted, mission-first kind of person. We see him very obviously trying to manipulate Ruying into willingly working for him. He says, and he gives this bit of backstory. He's like, I wasn't actually like a biological son of like the Roman royal line. I was adopted in. And she's like, oh, wow, like that must, like what was that about? And he's like, yeah, I was actually born like on the streets. My parents were super poor and destitute. So I stole from the Roman prince, just like you stole from me, haha. Except that when that prince came to find me, he told me to kill my parents and he would adopt me. She's like, wow, that must have been really tough to consider. And he's like, yeah, I killed them and got adopted.
What? The fuck?
What? And then he immediately follows that up with like comparisons about how like, they both are so similar. They were born with great powers. And it's like, no, you weren't. You were adopted. You don't have magic. You were adopted and you killed your parents to get adopted. That's awful. That's horrible. This is a girl who supposedly will do anything to protect her family, and you killed your family. There's even like a line later on, like post-time skip, where he says like, wow, I wish I had someone who cared about me as much as you care about your sister. You would do anything to protect her. I wish I had someone like that. And I'm like, you did. You had 2 parents and you killed them. You maniac. So yeah, he feels very manipulative, and there's all these times and all these conversations they have where like he's trying to draw parallels between them and their circumstances, but it's like they have nothing in common, not really. And the power imbalance makes it impossible for any sort of trust to feel genuine, at least to us, the reader. But Ru Ying is just so head over heels after 6 months, and we don't know what happened in that 6 months that got her to gradually like warm up to him and what he said in that time or did in that time to so thoroughly convince her that he had not just her, but her people's best interests at heart, to the point where all of these scenes afterwards, which are painted in very romantic light for the two of them and lean on a lot of romantic tropes, feel kind of gross to me. And seeing her unwavering faith in Antony feels so unearned and irritating. To see her reject her child, people she's known for years, her friends, her family, to stand by this colonizer. But we also see very late in the book, like in the final third, that at some point Antony did develop genuine feelings for Ru Ying. We get like one chapter, one short interlude during that. There's like the scene after the attack that happens on them both and they're wounded, where they're like taking shelter in a cabin and there's only one bed, and they're like having this heart to heart and kind of saying all of these flowery romantic things about like how if circumstances were different, they could have been something, they could have had something real. And then we get this like little mini chapter from Antony's POV where he's just like, wow, like it's so dangerous that I developed feelings for her. I'm going to have to let her go. Like she's going to hate me if she ever finds out the truth. And if she ever finds out like what I'm really doing. And so that is something we, the reader, have known for a while, that Antony is a terrible person, that he's been manipulating Ru Ying. But now we're also supposed to, for some reason, feel sympathy for him because, like, oh, he did actually fall in love with Ru Ying too, kind of, sort of. And then we see like a couple of back-to-back instances of him putting his own life at risk to save Ru Ying, which was like something she never thought he would ever do. And that's like when her already like we thought her wavering faith would tip over around this time, but instead she's like suddenly full team Antony again because he did these things that she thought were so out of character, only for it to again like very shortly afterwards come crashing down with like the lab scene and the confrontations. And that final scene with their conversation with Antony is just so infuriating because he's openly admitting and validating her fears that like, yeah, I've been doing human experimentation on your people, but we're getting some really good stuff out of it. And I really do care about you. And so at the end of it, when he like asks her to like still trust him and she lies and says yes, he just believes her. She was like so upset with him about lying to her and about like hiding things from her. And it's just like, it's a very weird conversation because I don't buy any of it, like from either side. I don't understand where Ru Ying's like anger and frustration is coming from because it feels very misplaced. And then I don't get why Antony believes her after coming clean and then still asking her to stay with him or at least like, you know, to still trust him. And it's very much written like we're supposed to feel some kind of sympathy or feel bad for Antony during this conversation. And I just don't. And so that leaves the ending of their relationship at this point in the book very unclear, and it doesn't feel like we've taken a true stance on their relationship other than us, the reader, like knowing this is bad and that this isn't a good relationship, it's not healthy. And at least from Ru Ying's perspective, there is no more relationship, but Antony definitely still thinks there is one. It wasn't cleanly ended in this story. And so for that reason, I kind of feel like the author might be writing or planning things for Antony that paint him kind of like Tamlin from ACOTAR, which some spoilers for ACOTAR if you don't know. Tamlin was the love interest in the first book, A Court of Thorns and Roses, with Feyre. And unlike this book, the two of them, unlike this book, Tamlin is a good person, it feels like, in the first book, and he and Feyre seem like they're getting a happily ever after. But then in the next book, Tamlin kind of flips and goes like really bad, like really evil, does really horrible things to Feyre. And so Feyre splits with him and ends up going to her true endgame partner, which is Rhysand, and Tamlin becomes a villain character. But he gets this sort of like mini redemption moment at the end of the third book in A Court of Thorns and Roses, where like he does like a couple things, or like kind of like backhandedly helps them, and does seem like remorseful and stuff, but like there's no chance of him and Feyre getting back together. So I feel like I wonder if Chang is going to do something similar with Antony's character, where from now on, like we started out with him already being a villain, and which is weird because, you know, Ru Ying fell in love with him in his villain phase, which was not true for Feyre and Tamlin. But I feel like Chang is trying to give us some threads that will give Antony some kind of redemption moment, at least, if not a full arc. And frankly, I don't want to see it. Not looking forward to that. So yeah. So last bit here, there's been a lot of talk and some reviews criticizing this book, and a lot of people calling it a colonizer romance, because Antony is, of course, the enemy prince, and Ru Ying is in the oppressed peoples that his empire is occupying. And so discussion about that, I guess. If you're willing to look at things from the larger picture, I think it seems pretty obvious that this is not meant to be a colonizer romance. We're not meant to see their relationship as healthy or like a happily ever after or an endgame plan, especially when you get to the very end of this book and you see that she does no longer trust Antony. And I think Baihu is being set up to be the ultimate endgame. But the caveat here is that a large percent of this story, like a good 80% of this story, is Ru Ying entertaining and being in love with a relationship with Antony, and being in love with Antony and trusting him wholeheartedly and completely, and being like all in on his plan that he claims is for the greater good of both of their peoples. And the writing of their romance, while she is 100% on board, like post to 6-month time skip, is both of them leaning into this romance. And we're seeing a lot of romantic tropes, and the writing style is very reflective of a like main romance story. And then the marketing for this book at some points in the cycle, ever since the book was announced, was both Chang and her publisher leaning into painting Antony and Ru Ying as the main pairing. They were using like enemies to lovers tropes. And I think at one point they claimed it was like Zutara, the Avatar The Last Airbender ship, on steroids. And just so many things like that made it look like they were marketing the book as in you, the reader, would want to read this book to see the relationship and the romance between Ru Ying and Antony. But I mean, the book itself is trying to convince you and Ru Ying, like several characters try to convince Ru Ying that this is not a good relationship. And then ultimately, it just doesn't feel like the colonizer elements are the main reason for their relationship falling apart at the end. Because again, it doesn't feel like the human experimentation as a whole is what bothers Ru Ying. It's more the fact that Antony lied to her and didn't release Talhua, her best friend. Her best friend specifically was targeted by the human experimentation. And those are the things that she is really hanging on when having that final conversation with Antony as well. So it doesn't feel like the fact that he is an enemy prince colonizing her people and doing horrible things to them is the main reason that Ru Ying ultimately loses trust in him and decides to turn against him. So I can't say this isn't a colonizer romance either, because for a lot of the book, she is willing to look past all of these horrible things he is supposedly doing and all of the horrible things he is making her do. Whatever your feelings are about it, you can share them in the comments, but I'm just going to say that's kind of where my spoiler thoughts end. So, whether or not you've read To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods, whether or not you liked To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods, if you read the synopsis or you've heard me talk about this book and you really, like me, liked certain elements of like the premise, or like the story, I have some recommendations for you to check out, either instead of or alongside To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods. And the first one is my very ultimate favorite book of all time, one of my favorite YA fantasies, and that is Graceling by Kristen Cashore. Graceling features a female protagonist who wields deadly powers that frighten her, much like Ru Ying and her death magic, and she is also forced to do things and use her powers that she doesn't agree with in servitude to an oppressor, which is her uncle the king, much like how Ru Ying has to work with Antony and do horrible things, and she has to convince herself that it's like, well, in her case, she's convincing herself for the right reasons. In the case of Graceling, the protagonist Katza knows that what she's doing is very wrong and doesn't see any justification for it, but she feels trapped in her situation. And that's why I think it handles this kind of predicament better than Ru Ying does, or than Wicked Gods does, because Ru Ying kind of gaslights herself into being okay with her current situation of working for Antony, whereas Katza knows that what she's doing is wrong and she doesn't like it. And that's why, unlike Ru Ying, Katza retains her agency and fights back and resists in her own way, and does a lot of things while under her current predicament that are still her ways of fighting back against it and, like challenging the perceptions about her powers. I also think it has a great romance. If you like the idea of this fictionalized China under occupation by a colonizing force, and you want to see people fighting back against it in other ways, I would recommend Song of Silver, Flame Like Night by Amelie Wen Zhao. The sequel just came out earlier this year, and I still need to read it, but I really enjoyed this book. It features a female protagonist who has special powers and has also been trying to live under the radar in an occupied, fictionalized China, and she wants to fight back as well, but she doesn't work with the colonizers at any point in this story. At least in the first book. So, and I don't think, and based on the way that one went, I don't think she's ever going to. So that is a different path than what Wicked Gods is taking. And then Wicked Gods actually comps Iron Widow itself in its marketing. It says like Red Queen meets something else and Iron Widow. And I think that's kind of an unfair comparison because I think Iron Widow is so much better than Wicked Gods, not just as a book in general, but even in some of the things that I think the marketing was trying to compare about the two of them. Because like I said earlier, Ru Ying sometimes feels like she's trying to be given these girl boss moments. And I don't think she earns them, and I don't think they work with her character. Zetienne, who is the protagonist of Iron Widow, leans very hard into themes of feminine rage that come from living in a fictionalized China with strict gender roles and more of the moral grayness. So Zetienne gets a lot of these moments, but they feel much more visceral and they feel more earned. And Zetienne is a much better portrayal of a morally gray character, in my opinion, than Ru Ying because she didn't gaslight herself. And I think Iron Widow also has a better romance, although it's not at any point entertaining the notion of colonizer and colonizee. Colonized and colonizer. So I just think it's really unfair to compare the two of them. And if you haven't read Wicked Gods, but you want to, don't read Iron Widow first. I just think it's very unfair. And Zetienne would kick Ru Ying's ass even without her mech. So, Final thoughts, I gave To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods a 2 out of 5 stars because I had honestly set my expectations pretty high for this release, but felt extremely let down by what I got. I don't feel super interested in continuing the series, but I may change my mind if feedback about the sequel piques my interest. I would maybe consider checking out future works by Chang, because I think she has interesting ideas and themes that she wants to play with. She just needs to improve her execution and writing style, which I think with better editing could be achieved. This book is actually currently sitting at a 3.6 out of 5 on Goodreads and a 3.3 on Storygraph, though I think the recent drama may have something to do with that. So definitely go read some of the reviews to see what other people thought of the actual book, and not just the reviews that are based on online drama. And that's it for today's book review. If you've read To Gaze Upon Wicked Gods, or if you plan to, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Or just leave a classical building emoji because Rome. And if you liked the video, feel free to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more. Thanks for visiting, and until next time, happy reading!